I spent the better part of a winter trying to build a round tabletop from individual segments, mitered the joints, glued them up, clamped the whole thing together, and it looked beautiful for about 4 months. Then the joints started opening up, one by one, little gaps, appearing like cracks in dry earth. I was frustrated, and I couldn't figure out what I was doing wrong. Then, the following spring, I visited a maritime museum up in Mystic, Connecticut, and I stopped in front of a ship's wheel that was built sometime in the 1750s, nearly 300 years old. This thing had survived Atlantic crossings, storms, salt air, and the constant torque of steering a vessel that weighed hundreds of tons, and every single joint was still tight. I stood there staring at it for probably 20 minutes, and I remember thinking, whatever these men knew about building circles from straight lumber, I need to learn it. Today, I am going to walk you through exactly what I found. The methods these wheelwrights used to build a perfect circle that could never fail, using nothing but hand tools and geometry. Plus, stick around to the end, because I will show you a layout technique with a simple pair of dividers that is faster and more accurate than anything I have ever done with a calculator. Let me show you what these craftsmen understood that most of us were never taught. A traditional ship's wheel is one of the most demanding joinery projects in the entire history of woodworking. It is a perfect circle built from straight boards, designed to absorb thousands of pounds of rotational force without a single joint loosening. And the men who built them did it without power tools, without modern adhesives, and without any room for error. Once you understand their thinking, it changes how you approach every curved or circular project you will ever build. So, who were these wheelwrights, and why should we trust their methods? Ship's wheel making was a specialized branch of the shipwrights trade that reached its peak between roughly 1700 and 1850, primarily in the naval shipyards of England, Holland, and the New England coast. Towns like Portsmouth, Salem, and Mystic had shops dedicated to this work. These were not artists or hobbyists. They were tradesmen whose work had to perform under conditions that would destroy ordinary furniture joinery in a matter of weeks. A wheel on a large sailing vessel, something like a galleon or a frigate, might be 4 to 5 feet in diameter with 8 to 10 spokes. When a helmsman turned that wheel in heavy seas, the forces feeding back through the rudder chain could be enormous. Hundreds of pounds of torque cycling back and forth, hour after hour, in an environment soaked with salt water. If a joint failed, the ship could not be steered. People died. So these craftsmen developed a philosophy that I think every woodworker should hear. They believed that strength comes from geometry, not from mass. You do not make a joint stronger by making it bigger. You make it stronger by making it smarter. Every angle, every grain direction, every wedge in a ship's wheel exists for a specific mechanical reason. And that thinking is what separates their work from most of what we do in a modern shop. The first method I want to share is how these wheelwrights selected and oriented wood for the rim of the wheel. The rim is made up of individual curved segments called felloes, typically 8 or 10 of them, each one an arc that joins to the next to form the complete circle. Now, most of us, when we need a curved piece, we grab a wide board, draw a curve on it, and cut it out on the bandsaw. And that works fine for decorative pieces. But the wheelwrights understood something critical. When you cut a curve from a straight board, you are slicing across the grain at constantly changing angles. That means somewhere along that curve you have short grain. For a ship's wheel, that was unacceptable, so they did something different. They selected stock, where the grain ran as close to parallel with the curve of the arc as possible. For the felloes, they often used live oak or teak, woods with naturally interlocking grain that resist splitting even under tremendous shearing force. They would examine each blank carefully, looking at the end grain, checking how the fibers ran through the full length of the piece. If the grain dove out of the surface anywhere along the arc, that blank was rejected. They called this reading the wood, and it was not optional. It was the foundation of everything that followed. The practical takeaway here is simple, but powerful. Anytime you are building something curved, look at your grain direction before you look at your pattern. A curve cut with the grain is 3 or 4 times stronger than one cut across it. Now, once they had their wood selected, they faced the real geometric challenge. How do you divide a perfect circle into equal segments, cut each one to the precise angle, and have them all come together into a ring with no gaps? This is the method that fascinated me the most. For a wheel with 8 felloes, each segment spans exactly 45 degrees of the circle. For 10 fellows, 36 degrees. The mating faces of each fellow are cut at half that angle, so for an 8-segment ring, Each end of each felloe is cut at 22.5 degrees off square. The wheelwrights laid this out using large trammel points, which are essentially two sharp steel points mounted on a long beam that acts as an oversized compass. They would scribe the outer and inner radius of the rim on a flat layout board, then divide the circumference into equal parts. Here is what impressed me. They did not measure the circumference and try to do arithmetic. They used the radius itself as a stepping tool. The radius of any circle steps off exactly 6 times around the circumference. So for a 6-segment ring, you just walk your dividers around the circle. For 8 segments, they used a geometric bisection method, dividing those 6 divisions further with a straight edge and compass. No protractor needed, no calculator, just geometry that has been reliable for thousands of years. The joints between felloes were always positioned between spokes, never at a spoke location. This is critical. If a fellow joint and a spoke hole land in the same spot, you have 2 stress concentrations overlapping, and that is where failure begins. And the joint itself only has to resist compression, not bending. That single rule, joints between spokes and never on them, is something I now apply to every segmented ring I build. Quick thing before we move on. Everything I'm sharing today comes from years of studying how the old shipwrights built, and I have gathered the best of what I have found into a book called Secrets of the Shipyard. 16 chapters, 25 hand-drawn illustrations, 150 pages of real craftsmanship knowledge. Scan the QR code on screen or hit the link in the description if you want to take these lessons off YouTube and into your shop. Now, back to what I learned. The third method is how the spokes are joined to the rim, and this is where you really see the difference between furniture joinery and joinery built for torque. In a piece of furniture, a tenon is designed to resist pulling apart or racking side to side, but in a ship's wheel, the primary force is rotational. The helmsman grabs a spoke and pushes it around. That means every spoke tenon is being sheared, twisted, and levered simultaneously. The wheelwrights addressed this with through tenons that passed completely through the felloe, with shoulders cut at a compound angle, matched precisely to the curve of the rim at that point. Think about that for a moment. Each spoke enters the rim at a slightly different angle relative to the surface of the felloe because the rim is curved. So every single tenon shoulder is unique. They had to be individually fitted. The tenons themselves were typically 1 inch to 1 and 1/4 inches wide and about 3/4 of an inch thick on a full-sized wheel, cut from teak or live oak to match the felloes. Once through the felloe, each tenon was wedged from the outside using small hardwood wedges driven perpendicular to the grain of the felloe. This created a mechanical dovetail effect inside the mortise, making it physically impossible for the spoke to pull back out. The species mattered here too. Teak contains natural oils that resist moisture and provide a degree of lubrication during assembly, which meant tenons could be driven home without cracking the felloe. When I tried this method on a small decorative wheel I built in my shop using white oak, the difference in joint strength compared to a standard glued tenon was remarkable. I could not break it apart. The fourth method combines the construction of the central hub and the overall locking strategy that ties the whole wheel together. The hub, called the nave, is the most stressed component in the entire assembly. Every spoke transfers its load into this one piece, and the steering shaft passes through its center. You might assume they just turned a solid block of hardwood on a lathe and bored holes in it, but a solid block would split. The forces are too concentrated. Instead, the wheelwrights built up the hub from multiple layers of elm, a wood chosen specifically because its grain interlocks in a way that makes it nearly impossible to split. They would take thick planks of elm, orient them so the grain directions alternated layer by layer, and then band them together with iron hoops before boring the spoke mortises in the central shaft hole. This is essentially a lamination technique. Centuries before we had modern laminating adhesives, the spoke mortises in the hub were cut with a slight taper, so the tenons wedged tighter as they were driven in. And here is the key to the whole system. Every joint in the wheel, felloe to felloe, spoke to felloe, spoke to hub, was locked using wedges and pins that created compression rather than relying on adhesive. Wooden pins were driven through the tenons at right angles, and fox wedges, which are small wedges placed inside a blind mortise before the tenon is driven home, expanded the tenon against the walls of the mortise from the inside. The result is a joint held together entirely by mechanical compression. It does not care about humidity. It does not care about temperature. It gets tighter under load instead of loosening. That is the genius of this system. The fifth method is how they finished and sealed these wheels to survive decades at sea. The wheelwrights understood that the best joinery in the world will eventually fail if moisture cycles in and out of the end grain at every joint. So their finishing process was deliberate and methodical. They started by flooding every joint with hot linseed oil before final assembly, letting it soak deep into the end grain and the interior surfaces of every mortise. After assembly, the exterior surfaces were coated with multiple thin layers of spar varnish, built up over days with light sanding between coats. The spokes and rim were sometimes treated with a mixture of tallow and beeswax, worked in by hand, which gave them a grippy surface for the helmsman's hands while also repelling water. The key principle was to seal the inside of the joints against moisture while allowing the exterior surfaces to breathe just enough to prevent trapped moisture from causing rot. A well-built and properly finished ship's wheel could last 80 years or more in active service. I have adopted their practice of pre-oiling joint surfaces before assembly on my own outdoor projects, and the difference in longevity is noticeable even after just a few seasons. Let me share some patterns I have noticed in my own work and in most modern shops that these wheelwrights would never have tolerated. The first is relying on glue to hold a structural circle together. Most of us laminate or miter a ring and trust the adhesive to do the heavy lifting. The wheelwrights treated adhesive as temporary at best. They designed every joint so it would hold mechanically, with or without glue. The second pattern is ignoring grain direction in curved work. We grab the widest board we can find and cut our curve, never thinking about where the grain runs out. The wheelwrights rejected any blank, where the grain did not follow the arc. The third is building joints that resist force in only one direction. A standard mortise and tenon resist tension and some racking. A ship's wheel tenon resists tension, compression, shear, and torsion simultaneously because of its compound shoulders and through wedging. The fourth is oversanding joint surfaces. We sand mating faces smooth out of habit, but smooth surfaces reduce the mechanical bond between wood fibers. The wheelwrights left their joint surfaces with a slight texture from the hand plane, which gave the wedges and pins more to grip. The fifth is treating circular work as a decorative problem instead of a structural one. The moment you think of a circle as an engineering challenge, your approach changes completely. These patterns are not hard to fix. They just require a shift in thinking. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is the layout technique I picked up that I use constantly now. When you need to divide a circle into any number of equal segments, grab a pair of dividers and set them to your best guess of the segment length. Walk them around the circle. If you end up short or long of your starting point, do not do any math. Just adjust the dividers by a tiny amount, roughly 1/2 of the error divided by the number of segments, and walk them around again. Within 2 or 3 attempts, you will land exactly on your starting point. The old wheelwrights could divide a 4-foot circle into 8 or 10 perfect segments in under 2 minutes using this method. I timed myself once I got the hang of it, and I can do it in about 3 minutes, which is still faster than calculating arc lengths and transferring angles with a protractor. It works because the error self-corrects with each adjustment. Try it on your next segmented project. You will not go back to the calculator. If this kind of traditional shipwright knowledge is something you want to keep learning from, grab a copy of Secrets of the Shipyard. 150 pages, 16 chapters, 25 hand-drawn illustrations, all covering techniques like the ones we talked about today. Scan the QR code on screen or check the first link in the description. Thanks for sticking with me through this one. These old wheelwrights figured out things about wood and geometry that most of us are still catching up to. Take what works, try it in your shop, and I will see you in the next one.